I'm going to demonstrate how to change the heads on this tape machine, the Studer A820. This procedure would be identical for any Studer A820 and for a Studer A827, which uses the same transport. It's analogous to changing the heads on any machine. I'm going to speak in general terms about how to change heads and why you would change heads. And then I'll show you specifically what we need to be aware of when you're changing heads on this machine. This machine is set up to accommodate anything from 8-track to 24-track. When you're changing the heads on a machine, what you're doing is changing the format of the recording from, in this case, 16-track to what we intend to do, which is 24-track recording. So right now the machine is set up for 16-track, and you can tell on this machine that that's the case because only 16 of the channels are showing any activity on the overbridge. On some machines you need to manually shut off the channels that you're not using, otherwise they'll be operating with no connected load and they can oscillate or do all kinds of odd electronic things, so you need to disconnect those channels. On some machines you don't need to do anything, you can just leave those channels flapping in the wind and it doesn't matter. So the first thing to do before you change the heads on any machine is shut the power off, because you don't want any energized circuits being shocked by the spark of removing or putting in new heads. On this machine, here I'll turn the power back on briefly. On this machine you can see there are a number of indicators that show you the activity of the different power supply rails. And when you shut the power off, it takes some time for the voltages to dissipate on those different rails. You can see this one is hanging on for a while. There's obviously some nothing connected to it, or very little connected to it, and the heavy capacitive filtering is still holding a charge. Now all these LEDs are out, so I'm fairly certain the machine is inert, so I can change the heads. So that's the first safety consideration for on an electrical basis. On a mechanical basis, you want to make sure that any parts that overlap the head assembly are removed prior to trying to take the heads off. Otherwise you could bend some parts, you could knock some things out of mechanical alignment, you could damage some bearings, things like that. So for example, on this machine, this lifter pinch roller assembly hangs over the base plate of the heads. So I'm going to need to remove this pinch roller before I take the heads off. And there's a cover plate that covers the electronic contacts for the head cores that connect the head cores themselves to the audio electronics in the undercarriage of the tape machine. This cover plate covers that junction, so this cover plate needs to be removed. Before I can remove that cover plate, this reel overhangs the cover plate, so this reel needs to be removed. So the supply reel needs to come off. Then I can take off this cover plate, and there are two size hex keys used on these Studer machines. There's a 2mm and 1.5mm. I'm sorry, 2.5mm and 3mm. This is the smaller of the two, the 2.5mm. You use this to remove any screws. You use the larger hex key to unscrew the captive screws in the base plate and to remove the hold down screw for the pinch roller. So you use the smaller of these two to unscrew this cover plate. These screws are designed so that you can partially unscrew them and they'll remain captive in this plate. It's pretty common for plates like this on this machine or other machines. It's pretty common for the threads in those cover plates to be stripped out such that these screws will actually fall out. So just be aware of that, and if the screw comes all the way out, you have to keep tabs on it. Conveniently, there's a little ashtray here that you can put the screws in if they pop out. So now I'm going to take this pinch roller off. For that I use a 3mm screwdriver or hex key, and that comes off. You can put that wherever you like. Be aware that the shaft of this armature here is lubricated, so if you put this down on something, it's quite likely that a little bit of oil is going to get on it, whatever you put it on. I'm going to put it on this stainless steel surface where the oil won't make any difference. But if, for example, if you were to put it down on top of a notepad or whatever, it could get oil or whatever on your notes. Now this plate that has the audio connections on it has two captive 3mm screws on it. These two screws screw into threaded inserts on the housing of the machine. On this machine and on quite a few Studer A820s and 827s, those threaded inserts get knocked off over time, and so these screws have no purchase. And at the moment, these screws don't attach to anything. It doesn't affect the electrical stability or the mechanical stability of the head assembly, but be aware that these screws may not do anything on some machines, on some 820s or 827s, when you try to screw these screws down to tighten that electrical contacts on this electrical carriage here, that those screws may not do anything. The 3mm screwdriver goes into 3 holes that form a triangular attachment here for the head assembly. You can unscrew those until you feel them click, and the click indicates that you've run out of threads and they're now no longer engaged. So now these 3 screws, which hold the head assembly in place, have been loosened, and I can take the head block itself up off the base plate. But the D-sub connectors, which are the electrical connectors for the heads, are still biting quite firmly into each other on the back here, and there's a series of D-sub connectors. There are 2, 4, 6, 7 of them for the 16-track heads, and there'll be 2 more, there'll be 9 of them in total for the 24-track heads. So what you need to do is you need to loosen this plate that holds those D-sub connectors. The most convenient way to do that is by using an Allen key or any L-shaped metal doodad. And you use the Allen key as a lever. You slide it under this metal plate. If these screws are engaged, you need to unscrew these screws from the frame of the machine. As I said, on this machine those screws don't engage. So then you lever on either side of this base plate using the Allen key, and that releases the D-sub connectors on the electrical connections on the back. Now, under this portion of the carriage, there are 3 cards that are the interface cards, the head amplifier cards for the heads on this machine, on this the playback heads on this head assembly. And those 3 cards are loose in their slots. And sometimes when you lift this head assembly, those cards will come with the head assembly. I'm going to lift it without disengaging them just to show you. So you can see one of those cards has remained attached. And the way to release that is just to rock this panel slightly. And then you can release that D-sub connector. And then you need to reseat those cards if they've come loose. So this is now the head assembly liberated from the machine. This cover protects the heads. You should always have that cover engaged when it's off the machine. And when you put it down, you should be careful to always put it down in an orientation where you're not going to be putting stress on the heads. It's a bad idea to rest the head assembly this way or this way, because then the heads, which are anchored on their base, are then putting weight on the base plate, and that can cause them to come out of azimuth or out of zenith. So best idea is to just leave the heads flat like that or inverted. These are the 24-track heads, which I'm going to be putting on the machine in place of the 16-track heads I've just removed. And there are a couple of things to be aware of whenever you're changing the head assembly on a machine. The capstan shaft is what controls the speed of the machine, and it is a critical part of the machine. You can see on this head assembly there's a nylon bushing inside the hole that the capstan shaft goes into to prevent the metal parts of this frame from scraping the capstan or causing flutter in future use. But it's still important to avoid banging into the capstan shaft with any metal parts. You don't want to rub it while you're trying to put the heads down. You don't want to. It's a metal part, so it's not going to get damaged that easily. But it's a critical part of the machine. You don't want it to get knocked out of plumb. You don't want it to stress the bearings. You don't want to scratch the surface of it. So the easiest way to avoid doing that when you're reattaching the heads is to sight through the hole that the capstan is going to be poking up through eventually, and use that as your reference for how to place the head. So I'm just sort of Star Wars docking this head assembly with the frame of the machine by using the capstan as the pilot. Then I'm staring through the capstan hole and just gradually dropping the capstan shaft through that hole. So now this head assembly is now resting comfortably on the frame. When I wibble it slightly, I don't feel any rocking. I don't feel there's any grit or anything underneath there, so I can go ahead and tighten this down. And to do that, you use the same 3 anchor points, these 3mm screws here. And it's a good idea to tighten them very loosely at first so that you don't put any tension on any part of the base plate, and then go back and finger tighten all of them. You don't need to cinch these screws down terribly tight. They're holding the base plate in place, but as I said before, it was resting comfortably in position, and you're not really changing the alignment when you cinch those screws down. So you don't need to worry about reefing particularly firmly on those screws. Having anchored the heads, I now want to make sure that there's good electrical contact on all these D-sub connectors, and you do that by doing the inverse of the removal procedure. That is by rocking this plate back and forth until you feel it seating comfortably on all the D-sub connectors. As a little extra measure of security, I like to press on the D-sub housings using a tool, either a screwdriver or one of the Allen keys, and you do that by finding each end of the D-sub connector and pressing on it slightly. You can feel there's a little bit of movement, a little tiny bit of play in each of them, and that just seats them completely so that you make good electrical contact. There are quite a few contacts in there, and these machines aren't brand new, so it's a good idea to make sure that all the D-sub connectors are seated firmly. All right, now if this were a machine where these anchor screws had any purchase, then I would tighten these screws down, and but at the moment this machine doesn't, so I consider this assembly to be attached, and I can put the cover plates back on, the cover plate and the pinch roller back on. You can power the machine up without the cover plate on, and if you have any question about the integrity or of any of the contacts that you've made, then that's not a bad idea. But I didn't do that, and I don't care. So, okay, so everything is now back and assembled. I can power the machine up and do the mechanical and electronic alignment.